I talk a lot about how absurd the whole concept of theology is and how a lot of religious apologists try desperately to justify the existence of their imaginary sky daddy, and when questioned on their blind and unsupported beliefs, they will play word games and try to insist that they actually have knowledge of things they cannot possibly and do not demonstrably have knowledge of. This time out, I take a look at an article by a Christian apologist who tries just this tactic and fails horribly all the way down. So the article is called Why I Am Not an Atheist and was written by Bill Anderson. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of Bill's background because honestly it doesn't matter. Your life history should have nothing at all to do with the philosophical positions that you take. All that ought to matter is the evidentiary path that you took to reach the point that you're at. Where you're born and how you were raised, that shouldn't matter at all. It should be all about how you use your brain right now to objectively and rationally examine the evidence and come to the most intellectually honest and evidentially valid position that you can. If you do it any other way, you're doing logic wrong, and I think Bill does it pretty wrong the whole way through, but we'll get to that. So the article says, I always wanted to be an atheist. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I grew up in a working-class Scottish home with many benefits and much happiness. No philosophy was more drilled into me than this. Be your own man. Do your own thinking. Don't let anyone else influence you, no matter who they are. Being an atheist is the ultimate Scottish working-class philosophy. Let's ignore the fact that atheism says none of that. It's just not believing in gods, okay? So Bill says he was raised in a non-religious home and he thinks, based on his history, that he ought to be an atheist because apparently atheism fits in with his claimed cultural identity, but he just couldn't make it work. That's not how things operate in the real world. Reality, and that's really what we're talking about here, is that either a God actually exists in factual reality, or there is no God in factual reality. Reality doesn't care about your background, it doesn't care where you grew up, it only matters how you reach your conclusion, and this was the first big red flag I encountered here. Then he goes on to say that in his teens, he realized that he couldn't prove gods don't exist, and therefore he decided that one has to. That's not a rational way of examining the world. He says, however, these arguments were not enough for me to become a Christian. You can't argue a person into heaven. While I had to concede that there was a creator God, I didn't think you could have a personal relationship with him. I based this on the problems of evil and suffering, as well as unanswered prayers in my own life. It took a literal, miraculous Damascus Road conversion experience on a construction site before I saw the light. Or as Jesus puts it in John 3, a person must be born from above by the agency of God's Holy Spirit. Well, to begin with, you haven't demonstrated that heaven actually exists, and no matter how hard you try, you can't argue a person into anywhere that isn't actually real. You will notice that everything Bill says here is emotional. There's no rationality in any part of his conversion rhetoric. He believes because it made him feel good to believe. He believes because he's emotionally invested in believing. Now, he doesn't go into his Damascus Road story, so I have no idea what happened. But suffice it to say, I'm willing to bet there's a much more rational explanation than the God did it explanation he apparently took. Having said all that, I don't believe in blind faith. My Christian faith is based on what I do know about God. But you know nothing about God. You have beliefs about God, but you have no knowledge. To know something, you have to be able to point to some objective basis for your claim. He has none because he can't even objectively demonstrate that his God actually exists. It is blind faith, whether he wants to admit it or not. He believes things from the Bible that cannot be objectively demonstrated to be factually true or even reasonable. It requires magic, and we have no evidence that magic actually exists. But theists don't want to admit this, so they pretend that they're being rational, and then they dance around all the questions that ask them to show their work. This is unfortunately common in religious apologetics, where you have theists claiming they know things they cannot conceivably know simply because it feels good to claim that they know it. I know that there is a creator, and the evidence of the universe supports the 3 O's of theology proper. God is omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. No, you don't. Belief, no matter how strong, is not knowledge. Even personal revelation, where you believe that a God came down to you and explained how shit works, does nothing at all to convince anyone else. I don't care about the claims that you make about an experience you supposedly have. I care what you can prove with objective evidence. These apologists never just say, something happened to me. They feel compelled to explain what it was, how it happened, and what it meant, all without having any way of determining if these interpretations are actually so. If you strip away those interpretations, those supposed experiences are nothing more than a story. I almost got hit by a car today. Well, that's a fact. It's something that demonstrably happened in the real world. But when you start assigning meaning to the event, when you start telling people that the event had to happen for a reason, and that somehow you know what that reason is without being able to demonstrate how you achieve this knowledge, you're just telling tall tales. The 3 O's are also reasonable grounds for the belief in miracles. But they're not objectively demonstrated. The whole "it makes sense to me" school of bad philosophy is fallacious on its face. It doesn't matter what makes sense to you. You have not established that a God exists in factual reality at all, and you certainly have no objective means of examining this deity to determine what characteristics or abilities it actually has. Without that, you cannot declare that unsubstantiated claims about unwarranted beliefs are reasonable grounds for anything. I know from theology that God is holy and therefore cannot be unjust or unfair. Again, theology doesn't actually prove anything. It's just an argument from ignorance where, because these unwarranted claims can't be disproven, they must be reasonable to believe, and that's simply untrue. Everywhere that Bill has used the word know, we ought to substitute believe blindly and be much more factually accurate that way. He has blind faith from theology that God is holy. That's all he can say and be truthful. Believing and knowing are not the same thing. Faith and fact are not synonymous. Just because you really want something to be true, that doesn't mean that it's actually true. I know that the Gospels are eyewitness historical documents as verified by archaeology, contrary to the trendy and naughty documentaries to the opposite that are often based on conspiracy theories. Right. No, you've got no way of knowing that, and all the evidence we have shows that it's unlikely at best and ridiculously untrue at worst. The fact is, the people who wrote the Gospel accounts, and we don't know who they were because the Gospels are anonymous, but what we do know, judging by a comparison between the stories, is that these people were not eyewitnesses. In fact, the writer of Luke says as much in his Gospel. And the Gospels report things that followers of Jesus could not possibly have witnessed, such as the elements that took place before Jesus was even born. At best, these elements are hearsay, but if these things are mere hearsay, then how can we trust the rest of the account, which may also be nothing more than the stories of a Jesus progenitor passed down by word of mouth? I know that God became human in the form of Jesus and that the Gospels documented his good person, life, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. And once again, no, you don't. You have no way of knowing any of that. You believe it, you have faith in it, but you don't know it. As we see here, there's a progression of bullshit faith claims piled atop bullshit faith claims, each assuming that the one that came before is accurate and true. But this is problematic all the way to the first claim, and because everything is built on that faulty foundation, the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. As soon as you introduce faith into the equation, you've lost. The geneticist doesn't have to have faith in DNA. They can go examine it objectively. The oncologist doesn't have to believe that cancer exists. They can go study it. But the apologist has no choice but to have faith that the whole basis of their proposition is real, because they have no real means of studying their supposed God, nor of demonstrating that any such thing actually exists in reality. Geneticists know DNA exists. Oncologists know cancer exists. Both of them can prove it, objectively and factually. Apologists do not know that God exists. They don't know anything about their theology. They just have blind faith, and blind faith is nothing to be proud of.